Bobbi, welcome to WeSpire Live. It is wonderful to have you here. And why don't you get started with introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. And I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to being a part of this conversation. I am the global inclusion leader at Kyndryl, a new company that is a spinoff from IBM, and I am responsible for our 5 global constituencies, our employee resource groups. And I work really, really hard to make sure that we focus on embedding inclusion, diversity, and equity in all parts of our business. And again, I'm really happy to be here today.
Is great. And I also want to introduce Juquanda. Juquanda, why don't you tell everyone, you're from Seattle, my home state, and are the CEO of Diversity Window. Would love to have the audience learn more about you.
Thank you. Hey, Susan. Good to see you again, Bobbi. Hi, everyone who attended. Thank you for taking time out to come today. I'm Juquanda Nelson, CEO of Diversity Window, where we believe data comes first. We work with organizations to help them gather, organize, and make meaning of their diversity, equity, and inclusion data to set DEI strategy and goals. We are huge fans of employee resource groups. I've had the opportunity over the course of my entire career, having done diversity, equity, and inclusion work for national organizations, global organizations, and really understanding the value that ERGs provide. So just really honored to be part of this conversation today.
That's great.
Yes, I am in Seattle.
It's great to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Hunt-Stevens, founder and CEO of WeSpire. And WeSpire helps organizations engage their employees in all aspects of purpose and impact activities, but particularly those that tie to your ESG goals. And increasingly, that has brought things that might have been siloed and in different areas of the organization together and more aligned, whether that's your climate and climate strategy, health and well-being, inclusion, and community engagement. And we have a lot of folks that work with us to do all of those programs, and some who work with us just do one of those. But earlier, when getting prepared for this, Bobbi told us an incredible story about her career at IBM and what she had the opportunity to do as a group of a part of IBM was being spun off into a brand new company. And so she got the opportunity to be able to create something in many ways with a huge legacy behind and total greenfield opportunities. So Bobbi, I'd love for you to tell people about the journey that you've been on as it relates to, inclusion and diversity, not just at IBM, but now in this new company, Kyndryl.
Sure. So at the time that Kyndryl was spun off from IBM, I had been at IBM for 39 years and 8 months. And I actually was having thoughts about retiring, but there was an opportunity, which I very strongly pursued, to have a day job, full-time job working in the inclusion, diversity, and equity space. And I thought, if I can do that, then I want to stay around a little longer. So flashback to that 39 years and 8 months that preceded that point in time. I had been a technical manager. I managed in data centers. I had done jobs like being a systems programmer, manager, senior manager, leader, delivery, everything, but it was related to technical. But somewhere in the last 10 or 11 years, I'd gotten really, really active in my local Dallas Black BRG. So being just an active member to a vice president, to the president, and then moving out to help bring together. Texas was the one state that was unique in that it had 3 Black BRGs. The only state where we had that. So bringing together events that we could all at least have a weekend, one weekend a year that we could thought share, that we could just really kind of fellowship and everything. And then even to the point where helping to bring Louisiana online, the Baton Rouge Black BRG. So that was really important. But in that time frame, I also helped to found a Center of Excellence for Black BRGs in IBM, because we had a number of them globally. So we could really justify a Center of Excellence for just one constituency. And of course, along all of those years, working on BRG optimization projects, looking at how we could help the leaders, enable them, to really, really bring value to the constituency. But it was the George Floyd murder that really was the catalyst for me that said, I want to do this. I want to do it full time, because so many things that I think that I had become less sensitive to over time, those micro inequities, the microaggressions, those this is Texas, after all. And so some of those terms that were being used and things that were being said that having grown up here, it just got to the point where I was used to it, but it wasn't right. It wasn't right just because I had gotten desensitized to it. So I decided, again, when the opportunity presented itself, that I would go to Kyndryl if I had the opportunity to come and do this as my day job. So I'm really, really blessed that all worked out for me. And I have really, really passionately jumped into working on the governance policy, defining what we would look like in this new company, how we would set up our programs so that they had real benefit to our constituencies globally. All 5 of them. We're bringing on a new one this year, but the passion for me was about just not feeling really, really passionate about it, but being able to translate that passion into actionable items that resulted in real benefit and value to our communities, to our diverse communities.
Yeah. And something you mentioned is notable, but worth mentioning. Inclusion is the first part of what your organization is called now. That was a deliberate decision. Tell us about what prompted that decision and how that influences how you are governed and organized and how you think about the groups.
It was absolutely intentional. And if you have been in the DEI space for any amount of time, you know that most companies have made some progress toward diversity, toward the number, right? So getting people and keeping them, I think, are 2 totally different things, right? So if you're just working on meeting your diversity goals, making the numbers, there were a number of people, companies that could give themselves a pat on the back. But what about the retention? Were you being able to keep the people? And I've heard so many different analogies, but I really like the one about, diversity being the dance. And, you can get invited to the dance, but once you're there, is there anybody to dance with you? Or do they say, you're here at the dance, you should be happy you were invited, go off over there and stand on the wall and entertain yourself. So inclusion is making sure that the people that we've invited to the dance now feel that they belong here, that they're comfortable here, that they're safe here, that this is a place that they really want to be, and that they have a dance partner. It could be a dinner and we have given them a seat at the table, but what at the table is served up that is something that is that meets their needs. So again, it was intentional. Inclusion. Let's talk about how we can make people feel included, because we really feel like we can. Right. We can attract, we can get the number. We need to make sure that when they get here that they feel included.
Right. And you mentioned safety. And one of the things that we've done a lot of work around is helping companies understand psychological safety across all employees. And some of the things that you find in doing psych safety work is that improving psychological safety benefits everybody. It's key to high performance, but it has a disproportionate benefits on people who are underrepresented in the workplace. Juquanda, you have this incredible overview. So I'd love to hear the arc of your career, but then also you get to work across companies. And I'd love to hear a little bit of what you think are the themes that people are bringing into 2023 and some of the biggest challenges that D&I leaders are tackling right now.
Yeah. So like I said, I'm a huge fan of employee resource groups. I early on in my career got involved, of course, with the women's group, because that's typically the one that gets the most funding, that has the most exposure, organizations are most committed to. And then I started joining other ones, joined, of course, the Black employee resource group, and, got into leadership there. And so through kind of my own experience participating and even seeing some of the inequities and disparities that exist between even some of the ERG groups, I just became this huge advocate for making sure the voices and the visibility of those employee resource groups who oftentimes don't get that level of funding or exposure. And so from there, I got into diversity, equity, and inclusion as a leader, and had the responsibility and scope to actually scale employee resource groups throughout organizations, again, nationally. And then I also previously worked for a global organization where we were in 41 countries, 275,000 staff. So really thinking about, what does an employee resource group mean? What does it look like? And how do we support it from an organizational perspective? You talked about some of the challenges. And so before we even get into ERG engagement and what they do, I think oftentimes in the way that we at Diversity Window help organizations with their employee resource groups is that we help with the infrastructure and the strategic positioning of them. Oftentimes employee resource groups start where, someone may experience something or they're looking for someone. So of course they start gathering people, and then they say, hey, we want to be an employee resource group. But oftentimes what doesn't happen is organizations don't have the resources to support them. So I tell people on my teams, I've had people who that was their responsibility. It was their actual role to make sure that our employee resource groups were supported. And then also funding, which is very important, because oftentimes if it's around development, if it's around awareness, gathering people together, you need that funding. And so for us, from an organizational perspective, it needs to be supported through resources and funding. And another piece of that too is they need to be connected to organizational goals, right? And organizational strategy. Again, I have benefited from employee resource groups as, in my career, oftentimes being the only Black person or the only Black woman. And then at the time being the youngest, because I was that loud millennial who, always had wonderful ideas and wanted to move quickly. And so that was oftentimes shut down, but they are a safe space for people. And I think we need to keep the integrity of that. And also, though, the goal is then how do we take that safe space that people feel within their groups and translate that into everyday work experiences? And the only way you can do that is by making sure that it is connected to the organization in the way that makes organizations better. And I know we're going to talk about data later, and I'll talk about how you can actually measure that and build that into ERGs. But that's the lens in which we see it, is how do we make sure organizations have the infrastructure to support them and that they're connected to an organizational DEI strategy or HR strategy, so that they are able to articulate the value and the importance of not only for the people participating, but actually for the organization who benefits off of that.
Right. So amongst our attendees, we have a wide range of people's maturity of their ERG programs and even their D&I programs broadly. We have people who have no ERGs and who are just getting started and wanting advice, and folks who have thousands of employees in ERGs and are asking, how can this get more baked into business strategy and things like that? So let's just kind of start at the beginning for a little bit. So Bobbi, you just started at a new organization, 5 new ERGs. What are some of the best practices, or what's some of the lessons learned that you would have for somebody who doesn't have ERGs and is just getting started? And then Juquanda, I'm going to ask you the same question as well. But Bobbi, love it. So someone takes you out for coffee and says, I want to start ERGs. What do I do? What would you say?
I would share the experience that I have had, and it's still a very new experience. And that is starting off with something that I can get my hands around. So the governance was really, really important. Everything cannot be a company approved, a company sanctioned ERG. Some groups are still just affinity groups. And the way I decided that we would draw the distinction is that company supported groups, company approved groups, ERGs, are eligible for funding. They are eligible for support from our Center of Excellence. The resources for enablement are provided for them versus an affinity group. So I cannot go off and say that, if you want to get together with 5 people and on the 3rd Thursday night of every month, go out and howl at the moon, and call yourself the Moon Howlers Club, you are free to do that. However, you are not a company approved ERG. That is the difference. So I certainly don't, I did not want to remove the ability for people to get together that were like-minded and wanted to spend some time together in activities at work or away from work. I just wanted to make sure that for those groups that aligned with business objectives and the inclusion, diversity, and equity strategic priorities, because we do have a strategy, there's a strategic plan, and there's pillars that go along with this. So those groups that meet a set of threshold requirements, they do get approved, and they get the benefits of being an approved company ERG. So starting out, I would say, think through the governance policy. Think through what it is. When you're small, it's not, it is less difficult. And I will say that, even though Kyndryl is a startup, it's a 90,000 employee startup. So it's quite different, right? And so I had to think in terms of what can we really, really get our arms around here. The governance policy was written to support us being able to say, these are the groups that we know are underserved, they're underrepresented, and we can say globally that is a fact. So let's start there. Now, again, I started with 5 global, and there is a new one being added this year for the AAPI community.
Right.
But in a year's time, we've added 70 plus chapters to those 5 enterprise levels that are aligned to those. But it is something that I can say, here's who you should align to, here's what the strategic priorities are, and I have a check to be able to go back and say, are you doing that? At the regional level, there's a check that says, I'm more familiar with this area, with this region. Here's what the governance policy is. Show me your documents. I need your mission, your vision, your charter. I need to see that within that, you're meeting the threshold requirements to be approved here. So that's what I'd say. Start with your governance policy. Understand what you want to do in terms of meeting your business objectives, whatever the strategic priority is. Start with building your governance policy and then roll it out from there.
Juquanda, I'm sure you agree with that as well. Then what have you seen that others also are doing when they get started, particularly about getting people excited and getting that process of the groups coming together? What do people do that really can accelerate that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with that approach. And I love that you called out the having affinity groups and ERGs, because that typically happens, like, especially with pet lovers, right? They're like, well, we want to be ERG because you're going to find quite a few people who are pet lovers, but unless you're like PETA or some organization who actually your service is around animals, in terms of an ERG, that doesn't really, right, make sense to align with organizational goals. But again, it is about creating a safe space for people, right? Or a kind of a space where people can be with their folks. So I look at it from 2 ways. So I'm going to speak to it first from an organizational perspective. And then there are times where they tend to start with people who are organizing. And I also have a background in community organizing. So I'm always a fan of like organize the people and then go advocate, right? So from an organizational perspective, similar to what Bobbi said, especially the structure, right, which is typically happening through an HR or, a DEI group. I think some important components of it include, what does that structure look like? How do we align ourselves to goals of the organization. So being able to articulate that, whether it's personal development of your members, whether it's awareness around a certain population or group or topic, also around recruitment. Like ERGs are a great place to get people to come to your organization. But again, if people are happy already dancing in the organization, that inclusion piece, they're going to be most likely to do that. So being able to be a leader in that, as well as even volunteerism, right? You typically see a lot of ERGs who are volunteering. So that's bringing exposure, parts of your brand, et cetera. So personal development, recruitment, volunteerism, and then also development as leaders. We talk to a lot of organizations where they say we can't find diverse leadership, especially when you start talking about leadership. And oftentimes they're in your organization and they're in ERGs, right? So that's an important component. So the way that you do that is you need a governance, you need budget, and you also need resources. And also a huge component that is oftentimes missing is that leadership support or executive support and exposure. Exposure is huge. You can have all these groups doing these amazing things, but if it's not getting the level of exposure and visibility to senior leaders, you're missing a huge opportunity within your organization. I think a best practice, and I remember the first time I did this, I think a best practice is to appoint executive sponsors to each of your employee resource groups, and I've set up the structure my team has set up the structure in a couple ways, but having an executive sponsor that does not identify with the affinity of the group. Because you're going to create that cross-cultural learning, and you're also going to give that executive exposure to people that they probably otherwise wouldn't have engaged with because of hierarchy or levels within the organization, but also learning. And then they can then advocate for those folks within their peer group and with other leadership. So you're creating learning even across that, right? But I also think you need to be careful about who some of those executive sponsors are, because not everyone should and can do that role. So those are the things. And so from an organizational perspective, definitely that with the goals. I think for folks which I've heard and seen a lot, where people kind of gather together and they might start these groups, or they find their people, right? And then they now are like, hey, we want to be supported. For those folks, I say continue to organize and gather, and then also carve out, what does it look like for you to feel supported within the organization to make it happen? And then go to your HR leader or your diversity, equity, inclusion leader, your leaders like Bobbi, to be able to get that support, but plan before and be able to advocate for yourselves in that way. And sometimes that's how they start, right? In an organization, and then the leaders start seeing it, start putting those resources in place, and scaling.
Yeah. I had the experience also of making sure that I was an executive sponsor for at the New York Times for an ERG. Workplaces sometimes have entire constituents that are very different. It might be union, non-union. It might be, the journalists and the business side, or it might be the doctors and the, and the more, the staff more in a hospital setting. And I think making sure that that there's executive sponsors representing the major constituencies as well, because that was something where that perspective being brought into the ERGs was really, really valuable. Now, you mentioned budgets. It's 2023. None of us know what's going to happen, although the most recent CEO confidence says we think we're going to be all right. But we've certainly seen some crazy stuff in the last 3 months, 4 months around ERGs, whether it was Elon Musk and what he did at Twitter, or, people feeling like they're getting backburnered. We have a question from the audience that says, given the current economic trends, what are the implications that you think are going to happen inside organizations? What should ERG leaders be prepared for? And what should executive leaders know about ERGs and how to make decisions related to ERGs in this context?
I can jump in on that. I think this is where, and even to broader, kind of DEI goals, right? I think a lot of even DEI functions are worried. I understand saying worried, but have concerns, because oftentimes if an organization hasn't put that commitment forth to diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, and not treated as a business priority, right? There is a fear that that's usually one of the first budgets to, first of all, a lot of DEI budgets are not the biggest budgets within the organization. They're oftentimes the smallest, I can tell you, because I've been there. And if there are cuts that need to be made in terms of budget, or you need to, kind of minimize a budget, that is an area where it's first targeted, because it's not a revenue generating part of the organization. And so when I think to how even DEI leaders and ERGs can be prepared for that, is aligning yourselves to the things that matter in the organization. I can tell you, we talked to tons of organizations at Diversity Window. And one of the things that always comes up is employee retention or talent attraction, or one of our good friends, Sean Graham Jr. says talent partnership. How do we get people to come into the organization is usually one of the biggest pain points and focus of an organization. So if ERGs are able to align their mission to, we are actually number one, we have a huge kind of power in bringing people to the organization if we are treated well and aligning themselves to recruitment efforts. Another component is employee engagement. If folks who are in these groups, are in ERGs, are typically going to feel more engaged because they found community within their organization. So being able to show that they have higher levels of engagement than those who do not participate in employee resource groups, that's a value add to the organization, because those employee engagement as well as recruitment or employee retention are typically the two biggest focus priorities of an organization. And so again, being very thoughtful and strategic around, this is where we're going as an organization. How do we align ourselves to show that we can actually help an organization get there through our collective power as employees in the organization?
Absolutely. So KPIs, you mentioned some KPIs and goals. Bobbi, how did you create the KPIs and goals, and how is, and is anything changing or evolving as you're now maturing as an organization around those KPIs and goals?
It is. So initially I started off with just the very basic stuff, right? Membership. How can you grow your membership from day one? And I started with basic stuff. At the time, we were using Slack, but whatever, you have Slack, Yammer, whatever. I measure your membership by, your engagement. How many people do you have in your Yammer channel now? How many people are actually engaged? And I started off from the beginning looking at that literally from month to month. At the beginning of the month and day 30, the end of the month, what did that look like? And what were we doing to actually get people interested, get them engaged, and really begin to build that membership? Because a lot of that tied also with investment. What do we need to do? What does the investment need to look like in order to, to progress the work that we're doing in this ERG or in this space, in any particular space? Again, basic stuff. I measured people on, this is still kind of a thought, and it certainly will change. But when you look at a progression map, you have foundational, then, you build from there up to maybe aspirational, in terms of what the maturity model looks like. So I started with foundational and said, you should have all of your foundational documents. Your organizational structure should be in place. Your mission, your vision should be there. Your charter should definitely be in place. All of these were threshold requirements to get started. But after you've done that, what have you done in terms of, do you have your core team built yet? What will that look like? Having an executive sponsor was also part of the threshold requirement. But, how frequently do you engage your executive sponsor? On what level do you engage them? Those are the things that I measure at the foundational level to make sure that we are building, starting with the basics and building a solid foundation for the ERG as we move through the phases in the progression, model.
Juquanda, talk about transformational KPIs. So we do have folks, because I have the privilege of working with some of them who are on that sort of transformational journey. What are the KPIs that, that are aspirational in nature, transformational in nature, that very few organizations have reached yet, but you would love to see more get there?
Yeah, so metrics around development, because again, and I tell people all the time, read organizations' diversity, equity, and inclusion reports and see what they're doing and see what they're talking about as key performance indicators of overall DEI work. It's always around development of people within the organization. So tracking from your ERGs, who are getting development opportunities, whether it's expanded scope or getting promotional opportunities, who might get a level of leadership that may, align to an organization. Some organizations, 50% of women on executive team, or 50% of, et cetera, or whatever the metrics are around people, aligning to that and being able to track that. And then also, again, recruitment. Are our ERGs bringing in talent to the organization? Also, let me go back before I even get into this. It goes back to the organization making a commitment to provide the infrastructure to do that, because someone needs to track this data. So I'm going to call that out specifically. So if you don't have that, advocate for that first, right?
Amen.
So back to
Amen.
that. So back to that, are they participating in recruiting events? And then also another metric is how much time are ERGs volunteering on behalf of our organization? That is a brand move. And we know, I think the statistic is 75% of people want to work for organizations that they see actively involved in community, right? And supporting outside of the organization. So that is a key brand metric. How many hours are our ERGs volunteering with community organizations to support our mission? And then there's also retention, which is huge. Again, are we keeping folks what are the retention metrics for people who are involved in ERGs compared to those who are not? A lot of organizations do employee satisfaction surveys. So something as simple as adding, are you involved in an employee resource group, letting people check that box or not, and then measuring the engagement levels for an organization for folks who are participating in an ERG and who are not. And at the highest level, how is the ERG actually impacting an organization? I have seen, again, through my many years of being involved as well as launching ERGs. And that's one thing that I did when I was, a DEI leader, is advocating for the ERGs to be a voice at a table. I use this example all the time when I was in healthcare, leadership in a room from all parts of the organization trying to solve an issue, right? And typically those people are not the most diverse. And so they sit in the room, like I have been a part of that. We sit in a room and we try to solve issues, and we can make decisions, we can put resources behind it and people, but we don't have the diverse perspective to solve those issues. And one time I said in a meeting, none of us have this experience. So let's table this and let's go and do focus groups with our ERGs who actually have the knowledge and the subject matter expert. And so another metric is how many focus groups have our ERGs participated in to help solve a business issue. I was at an organization, and I don't know if I can use names or not, so that's why I'm being really cryptic, but I was at an organization where we were making some changes to some services, and the Black network, said like, hey, there's no reason why I should not be able to go to the specific part of town that is the population is predominantly Black and get a certain service that Black people use. And so we gathered together with our merchandising team, with our marketing team, and said, hey, as you're making this change, these are the services that you need to be able to provide to connect with those organizations. Absolutely. I've seen it happen with folks from other employee resource network or employee resource groups who also lend it, their voice and their perspective. So including that in your metric, our ERGs participated in XYZ focus groups to help solve this business problem.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because, it's one of the things that having a technology that hosts and manages ERGs for companies, obviously just counting members is much harder than people realize, let alone who's active and who isn't. And then based on how active they are, how it's having an impact on outcomes. But often what you also need to connect into is which outcomes. And so one of the things I would say that we've experienced as some of the transformational outcomes is when you can connect employees who are very active in ERGs and your ERGs into your innovation pipeline or your marketing and customer segmentation and customer revenue development pipeline, or even risk management. Like, how many times have companies just blown it with a certain audience because they didn't even think to run the ads, trying to target that group by their own employees who are members of that group. And so they did something really dumb, or their agency did something dumb. And so risk management is another. And I think that's when you start to really see those transformational impacts on the business, is when you get wedded into the core strategy of the business. The last thing that I am just going to continue to advocate for is that psychological safety metric, and really understanding how actively being involved in an ERG is improving an employee's psychological safety. Since Google, thank the Lord, did a 2-year project and it looked at every metric around high-performing teams and realized that psychological safety and those teams with the highest levels of psychological safety were the highest performing teams. So if you can start to link that active ERG membership is tied to psych safety, you can start to really tie it into performance. All right, this is going to be an interesting question, and that I think is subtly asked a lot, but let's talk about allies and the role of allies in ERGs. But there's a question from an anonymous attendee that said that some organizations still have challenges with white men feeling left out or marginalized in the DEI conversation, even though they still have power and privilege throughout the organization. So how do you address allies, and how do you address, if you do have a challenge with white men in the organization, what advice do you have?
Okay, so I can start. This is something that has come up probably several times recently, and it was really a struggle for me. The thought was really a struggle at first because inclusion is about people that have historically been underrepresented, underserved, marginalized, and I actually had someone make the argument that the white male was becoming that definition, that they were underrepresented, underserved, and marginalized. And honestly, what I have is numbers, data, and data does not say that at all. And we work with following the data, right? And so for the people that feel that, data doesn't support it, but for the people that feel that, yeah, I suggest becoming a part of the reality. You can become an ally to groups that truly are underrepresented, that truly are marginalized, and lend what you have to making sure that we don't have to talk about them in that set of numbers. So that has been met with some positivity. There is still some negativity that exists that says, no, I won't accept it anyway. And I think we have to come to, for me, I have to get to the point where, I am, sometimes the position to me is incredulous, but I'm trying to flip it. I really am trying to flip it and understand why you feel this way. And often it is because a person of color or a woman or some other marginalized group got the promotion that person felt was theirs, that they owned it. But again, I'm asking how you can be a part of, how do you see that you can be a part of being in this reality and positively contributing? Maybe if what you're looking for is the, I don't want to say popular, that's not it, but the recognition in this space, why not be recognized for actually being a part of the solution to the real problem that exists?
And being that ally and that voice. Juquanda, do you want to add anything to that question?
Bobbi said data Data first. So start with the data. And to be fair, especially for global ERGs, it's not all like when populations look very different than us kind of US centric. Starting with these are the minority voices or folks represented in the organization, and that's what it's centered on, right? So whatever that looks like for you. And I also want to call out, that is not the responsibility of ERGs. The ERGs are not responsible for helping leaders understand. It is the responsibility of an HR leader and a DEI leader to be doing that work to help bring them along the journey. It is not the responsibility of our ERGs, because again, that goes back to broader DEI work that is happening in an organization to help, with some of those ideals and beliefs, with the recognition that I think you almost said, Bobbi, is not everybody is going to be part of the work. And I just don't spend my energy on those folks, right? Just, that's okay if you don't want to be a part of the work, but also stay out the way.
Well, and
that's when we have a problem.
Well, and I do think when also you get back to the focus on inclusion, what you can also recognize is that there are the framework that was most powerful for me to understand is what are the in the house behaviors and how we treat each other, and what are the out of the house behaviors and how we treat each other, and what are the groups that are feeling in the house and what are the groups that are feeling out of the house for different ways. And when you think about that exclusionary behavior and who may be feeling excluded, sometimes you can also uncover some of those other factors that that cause micro inequities and exclusions. One of the most interesting ones that I ran into when I transferred divisions with the New York Times and actually came up here to Boston was there was a lot of bias against people with the very thick Boston accent, and it got referred to and did not receive promotions, did not receive the same level of talent opportunities, were marginalized usually into the more union labor oriented jobs. Individuals felt like they had to change their accent in order to get promoted, and things like that. And that transcended gender and race into something that was limiting opportunities for individuals that we had to confront as an organization, and to recognize that there were presumptions, there was assumptions that were the limiting opportunity for very, very talented individuals. And so I think as an organization, back to this is the DEI leader's job and this is the HR leader's job. As a DEI leader and an HR leader, you need to understand who's being excluded and why broadly, recognizing that there are systemic biases against certain groups in the workplace that need the support more deliberately from an employee resource group and things like that. Now let's talk global. Both of you have worked with global organizations and in global organizations. And there's several questions from attendees about how do we take ERGs global? How do they need to be thought of differently globally? What are some of the factors and the advice you would give for folks as we start to think about globalizing ERGs in our company?
I would say start with understanding that from a global perspective, as Juquanda said earlier, everything doesn't look the way it looks in the United States, right? So I started with listening sessions with different constituencies and from people in different countries of that constituency, because I can't talk with the women's group, for example, in the United States and understand the challenges that exist for women in India. Stories where I've heard where when they walked into a room for a meeting or attempted to walk into a room for a meeting that was majority men, the door was closed, that did not allow them in. Certain seating arrangements in different places, places where an LGBTQ person's life could be threatened if they were open with. And we talk about bring your authentic self to work when people are in a situation where being their authentic self could get them killed, could get them beat up. So for me, it was having the listening sessions and understanding from different people what the real issue was that we needed to try to help support them in or help them support through. Basis just saying, we know it's women or we know it's LGBTQ plus, so let's make a policy. There is not a one size fit all policy that works from a global perspective.
I also think if we think about it through the lens of, because typically there's a gap. That's usually how they start. There is some sort of gap within the organization as well as outside of the organization, right? And so looking at what are those gaps that exist in the organization, whether it's seeing other people or leaders that look like you or having those experiences where you can't show up as yourself, et cetera. And then think about how can we change that from our lived experience in an organization. And that looks like, how do we look at policies that may be preventing people from being able to show up as their authentic selves, or maybe gaps, even just some ways in working for people with disabilities, right? For especially non-visible ones, typically our workplace isn't supporting that, right? Or looking externally, you kind of talked about mistakes that organizations make externally where they might put a campaign out or something. And some people, like, I think of a couple examples specifically around Black, the Black community where, something's put out and they're like, oh, it's racist. And I'm like, what I see in that is that they had no one Black in the approval process or the ideation process or anything, right? And so thinking about how do we bring those voices and experiences to an organization? So whatever the gaps are that are either making people feel like they belong or gaps to how you are serving a certain community within your business, start filling in that gap and using that to let that be your focus. And then of course it's around awareness, bringing people together, and then solving those issues within an organization.
Yeah. So over the past 3 years, we've all undergone the biggest experiment in work ever, which is hybrid and remote work. Many people are full-time remote, many people are hybrid. How have ERGs needed to adapt, and what are some best practices that you've seen for organizations that are heavily remote, both domestically and globally?
Yeah, I think I think there are times where there needs to be a broader kind of gathering around issues just for people to learn and be aware. Like, I have many affinities, but I've been a part of other affinity groups or other ERGs who have a different affinity because I want to learn their experiences. So I think having those broader ones that are, again, high visibility, everyone can access, but I think also creating those kind of more intimate settings where sometimes, another thing that we've done in our ERGs is add in an ally chapter. So it might be allies of Black professionals, allies of the LGBTQIA community, et cetera, adding allies, but then still creating that space where we are absolutely going to gather everyone, but we want to also have those moments where it's just us, because sometimes we need that space to process and share and gather. I know we're not, especially, but I've worked in global organizations where it's only been remote, right? And so it works, but it requires a level of intentionality and for us to work a little bit harder to make those connections, but it's very possible. So think about how do we bring that broader engagement and also those intimate moments.
Yeah. Bobbi, what have you seen? Kyndryl, obviously, as a technology company, probably has a decent number of people working remote and hybrid. And what's worked?
Yeah, so I would just totally plus one everything that Juquanda has said. And I would add the things that it's really important, those cultural moments that are specific to the different constituencies, the celebration moments, to be able to do those in a remote environment. We have had to really, really look at ways to be creative. Everybody do the same thing at a certain time in their time zone, right? Yeah. But we can all come together and see each other. We have literally had scavenger hunts, with everybody doing some prep work. I mean, I think there is a way to do it and do it as successfully. As Juquanda said, it takes a high level of intentionality and thought, but it is possible to be able to do it and to do it in a way that is not, it's productive and it is impactful for the communities and the constituents that are a part of it. I mean, we had to learn, we had to adapt, we had to pivot. And I think we knew how to do it the old way. If things ever get back to the point where it's conducive for us to do that again, I think we will do a bang up job at it. But we are learning to do it in an environment that is that is less than ideal, but it certainly is workable in a way that it is impactful.
Yeah. One of the things that's been interesting for us as more and more ERGs are using technology platforms to enable their work because of remote work, is it's had this little sort of interesting side challenge for D&I leaders and organizations, which is that you start to get visibility for which ERGs are really, providing a lot of opportunities for connection, community, impact, events, things like that. And which ones are kind of a list, and aren't really having an influence on the employee experience. And that's positive because you begin to realize, okay, this one is really thriving and this one isn't, but it does force you, once you have something that brings visibility to it, to start to realize. And obviously, if you have good leadership like Bobbi, she's figured that out before and didn't need the technology, but it's been an interesting side challenge for some organizations of like, ooh, yeah, this really is making it obvious that this is really a list of people who haven't made the leap from what used to be in-person and connectivity to any sort of asynchronous or connected or digital or virtual or remote activity on that. Budgets. So one of the things that we saw in this transition and in hybrid is that some of our clients, ERGs, started getting budget to bring people together once a year. And that was something that they hadn't needed to do before because they weren't always remote. And so that started to become part of the budgets. There's a question from the crowd about how do you determine budgets for ERGs? Is there a formula? Is there a strategy around it? Is there certain elements? So what advice would you have for people who are wanting to start to create a budget for ERGs? How do they think about it?
Yeah, so that's work that we are just going through now. And here in Dallas, I am a member of the DFW BERGs. That's a collective of Black employee resource groups, BERGs. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. And I have found that, some people just there are companies that have like $1.2 million allocated for their DEI budget. There are others that have just a tiny amount, based on the number of people in the group, the number of people overall. So there's a number of different formulas that I have seen being used. But I think the best thing is when that corporate budget is allocated, whatever it is, to be able to find a way to pass that on to the groups, at least at the enterprise level, at the global level, and let them make a determination on what their investment is, what it will be, right? Because trying to bring together everybody in, one big group for one big face-to-face meeting literally could smash the budget, the entire year's budget. So I think it's best, we don't know what we have, but whatever we have to work with, give the autonomy and the decision to the groups to say, this is where I'd like to make my investment.
And I'll add in, because this is where you have to get creative. There's always going to be a recruitment budget. So this is where getting really smart, partnering with your talent team. There's always going to be a sales budget. So figuring out how you can get some budget from the sales team, whether it's bringing a speaker in or connecting to sales efforts. Operations is always going to have money and how to make things better. So tapping into operations, saying, hey, we're going to help you solve XYZ, whether it's through your people or services. So think beyond even your HR budget or your DEI budget, and start building a allyship and alignment with some of those revenue generating parts of the business to show that you can help support them.
That's great. Our last question that we're going to have time for today is also a very thoughtful one, which is, how are companies and how are your companies responding to legislation like the Stop Woke Act in Florida? And what role should DEI leaders and ERGs have in forming a corporate response to that type of legislation, if any?
I can speak to that because we're having to navigate that actually. So I think ERGs, of course, right, when it comes to legislation, the legal team is going to be your best team, best friend, unfortunately. But I think still bringing that level of awareness to the organization is still possible. Specifically around that legislation, it's around formal training. So it doesn't really apply to ERGs. It's if people are forced to participate. So check with your legal team first. We're looking at language, unfortunately. So how we talk about it, I think the example that Bobbi gave earlier around what inclusion looks like, she didn't have to say anything specifically, but she was able to articulate a concept or a behavior or feelings, etc. So just getting really creative around how you talk about it and the language that's used. It's a little bit deeper than that. We don't have time to get into it, but ERGs, like check with your legal team first, but in terms of the legality of it, you can still engage and bring awareness around those topics.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, and look for things through your legal team, as Juquanda had said, where you actually can engage and have an impact. For example, signing on to the Friends of the Court letter in Brazil last year, where it appeared that the government was not taking any action for the Afro-Brazilians that were also people of color that were being killed at a very significantly high rate. So, I mean, there are the things that the community will know about specifically that that they would be able to take and go to the legal team with.
And I think the, one of the things we've watched and encouraged is that, employees are able to influence companies. And when employees say to leadership, listen, this is really important to us that this doesn't pass, or we think this is awful for these reasons, and we want you to take a stand. Organizations need to have a rubric for determining what they're going to take a stand on or not, and to put it through the lens of their strategic goals. But most organizations have a strategic goal that is around inclusion and impact. And so I think this is one of those times where in most companies, that rubric, it would trigger we need to respond to this, because that is in their strategic goals and their strategic imperatives that we live in an inclusive culture. All right, well, we have reached our time for today. Juquanda, Bobbi, it was awesome to talk to you. Thank you so much for your insights and your wisdom. I just know that our attendees got so much value out of your advice and best practices and perspectives. And I would just encourage everyone to reach out to you both. Juquanda, I'm sure you could help everyone be better. And Bobbi, I can't wait for that article around that we talked about earlier around the balance between passion and insanity, because I think I need it. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month at WeSpire Live.
Thank you.
Bye.